Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Arts House, family of Mr. Thomas, and Ethos Books, I would like to thank you for making time to come to this launch, Memoirs of a Migrant. There are amongst us, many of us, who are privileged to know the late Francis Thomas, who have been blessed by the interaction with him. And there are others, like myself, who are very young, too young to have known him personally, but who knew him through the book that he wrote, Memoirs of a Migrant. Regardless of whether we knew him personally or through a book, I would encourage every single one of us here today to look at this new edition of his book and to find out more about the man, because it is to me as a publisher, who has been publishing books for the last 15 years, this book has been one of the most emotive books in my life, because the spirit of the man, the late Francis Thomas, permeates the entire book and really inspired and encouraged me in what community is all about. And I will encourage you to read the book and be inspired by it as well. Right? Now, how uncommon a man he is, I will leave it to those who have known him to come up and share. And so I will leave Margaret to talk to you and to introduce the book to you. Thank you. Okay.
Maybe the speakers would come up and sit here, so the seats are vacated for latecomers. Anne, Robert, Pat, Catherine, sit down, please. There are more seats in front here if anybody wants to move up. It's all very informal, so sit on the floor if you feel like it. All right. Can you hear properly? Is the system too fuzzy or something? Not that I can do anything about it. Okay, right. I wish I could, later on when Catherine speaks, she'll stand up and just talk eloquently without any. I'm more of a writer than a speaker like that, so you don't mind if I refer to something because I forget things. Memoirs of a Migrant was first published 40 years ago in 1972. It's been out of print for a long time. And in the last 15, 20 years, I tried several times, spoke to publishers about reprinting it. But nobody was keen, and I can understand why. But it began to seem a bit of a lost cause. And I was thinking in terms of publishing it myself, perhaps as an e-book. And then Robert Yew, who is an old boy and a former teacher at St. Andrews, encouraged me to talk to Ho-Fang, yeah. And when I spoke to him, I was surprised when he readily said yes, and which is why we're here today. So thank you, Ho-Fang and Wai-Han, his wife, for taking on this book, for agreeing with me that it's something that should get back into circulation. And thank you, Robert, for pushing me to do so. Why did I want to see Memoirs of a Migrant reissued, come back in print? It wasn't just a case of a daughter wanting to do right by the father, though of course there's some element of that. As a Singaporean, I would like to see a much richer documentation of our history. More accounts of the lives led by people, a whole range of people, both extraordinary and ordinary. The Singapore we see around us today was built by many, many people, not just leaders who deserve their accolades. But a lot of us contributed to it. And I think we should be hearing and reading their stories, their realities, and their truths. Also, I think Memoirs of a Migrant does offer some lessons, and I'd like to read a few lines from it just to illustrate this thing. One lesson is that it is okay to admit to having weaknesses, to having made mistakes. This my father does in excess in his book. One friend who read it recently said to me after, she read it in one go, he said to me after that, he's very honest about himself, isn't he? Brutally honest. And I think it's something a lot of us might want to think about doing. Another lesson is the approach he took to people. And let me quote a few lines from the book. Okay. It is part of the interest of the world that people have different races and languages and ways of life. I don't regard everyone as equal. I just don't think in those terms at all. People are people. Sometimes troublesome, sometimes pathetic, nearly always kind. Trying to classify races as superior or inferior is a futile waste of time. One point that comes up again and again in Memoirs is his frustration with bureaucracy, with structures and systems that reward conformity and stifle individuality and initiative and creativity. As a teacher and principal, my father was always much more concerned about the laggards, the misfits, the naughty boys, the rebels, the forgotten and the misunderstood, the underdog. And he writes, and let me quote again, we must not, and in his book he emphasized not in capitals, we must not close our minds and hearts to the needs of those who do not neatly fit into the schemes of our changing society. The schemes change rapidly. What we reject today may be the keystone of the next thing we have to build, which is a point not always understood or accepted by Singapore's policymakers, the people who used to sit here and who now occupy the more glorious chamber across the road. Singapore is changing even more rapidly today, and all the more we need those who question, who challenge the status quo and the sacred cows, and who have new ideas to offer. This second edition of Memoirs has additional material. We've just reproduced the original book in its entirety, nothing changed, we didn't try to update anything as it is. But we've included some more photographs and a selection of my father's other writings, speeches, some very short, some quite long. Most of this material was speeches and so on. They were written in the 1970s, but many of the points he made still hold true today. For example, in one speech, I think it was at an OBA dinner, he said this: we are moving into a depersonalized society where the individual loses value and is treated as a unit of cost. Our revolution must be to recognize the personal value of each individual, his right to be different, and to follow his own way of life. This will not be easy in the new Singapore, but it is vital for the future. He made the speech in 1974, it's 40 years ago. We are now in that future he was talking about, and we are still struggling to get away from being treated as a unit of cost. So finally, there is in this edition a section called Tributes to Francis Thomas. In 1978, about a year after he died, his old friend Devin Nair, who was then running the NTUC, wrote to St Andrews alumni and various others, former political colleagues and so on, asking them for contributions to a book he was planning that he wanted to call Memoirs to a Migrant. He got a handful of responses, but he was too busy to chase around for more material, and to complete the project. And I was not yet a journalist and much too young in any case to attempt to complete what he started. He eventually passed the material to me, and it's been sitting in my files for, well, 40 years, 25 years. And I'm very glad that we're finally able to do justice to both Devon and my father by publishing these tributes. That's all I have to say. We've got various family members here, and on behalf of my family, thank you all very much for coming and for supporting this event. And I turn it over to the various speakers, all of whom knew my father in one capacity or another. And we worked with him on the Anglican Welfare Council Committee and was in the social service sector. Robert Yew was an old boy and a teacher. Catherine Lynn was a teacher. She was my teacher at St Andrew's School, because I didn't know for you. I must tell you this story. My father was principal in the 60s, and we lived in the Roosevelt House, which is the principal's house. In those days, principals lived there. And I'd done my O-levels at Methodist Girls' School, and I didn't want to go on to where most NGS girls go on to, which is ACS, no one else wanted. I didn't ask for that. And so we had, after doing our O-levels, you had to fill in this form. This was the practice in those days. And by the way, my year was the last year of O-level people who did not have a JC to go to. The first JC, NJC, opened its doors just in time for the people here after me, which included Lisa and Dawn. Anyway, so I initially filled in, I think my first choice was Raffles or somewhere like that. But sheer sloth got the better of me. Because I looked at this again before submitting it. Now, if I get to Raffles or wherever, I have to wake up at whatever time to get to school by 7. And if I put St Andrews first and I go to the school, I can roll out of bed 10 minutes before the bell and walk to school, which is what I did. And sloth got the better of me, and I ended up going to the school my father was principal of, which was a bit awkward at times. But I'm glad, because it gave me a deeper sense of being a saint. So again, thank you all for coming, and Anne, for starting. I first met Margaret when I was invigilating the university exam, and I had to look at everybody's eyes see. And I thought, oh, John Thompson daughter. That was our first. I'm sure everyone St Andrew's School has really an interesting history, and had the extraordinary good luck of having one distinguished principal after another. Because obviously Captain Adams had been a remarkable man, about whom I mainly remember that he said, if they want to fight, I'll introduce rugby. And if they still want to fight, we'll have some boxing. That was pretty, I think, unusual in those days. So Francis inherited this great tradition. And it's wonderful that we're having these memoirs. I see Lena has just come in. I can remember Lena telling me that there was a very limited market for memoirs. The trouble is, that's a very keen market. Maybe a lot of people are not interested, but those who are interested are desperately interested. And I think it's marvelous that they're getting this new edition. I have to confess my personal contacts with Francis were very limited and relate only really to the Anglican counselling, schools counselling service, which was a really pioneering. Nobody else was doing anything to do with schools counselling at that time. Well, I can't speak for the Catholic schools, maybe they did, but the first institutionalised counselling for schools was this Anglican schools counselling service. But it was, and already one knew about Francis Thomas because, I mean, from the social work world, he had another unique characteristic, was that, as those of you who are old enough will know, Singapore was very largely just a network of shanty towns and kampongs. Even in the late 60s, 31% of households were living in a wooden house. And around St Andrews at Potong Pasir, there was an enormous kampong. No, actually, kampong is too good a word. They were really shanty towns. They weren't organized kampong. And Francis Thomas had his students going out and doing communities investigations and trying to provide some kind of service. I don't know all the details, but I know we were very impressed at the way the boys from St Andrews were encouraged to get down there and find out how people were living. The schools counselling service, the trouble was that quite soon other schools wanted civil service as well, and so the title became not quite appropriate. And before the schools counselling service grew the schools counselling service, which is still, maybe I've got the name wrong, but it's still there out as a multi-centered service. And the service was quite unique. And I think she was really pioneering something much bigger, because the Anglican side of it became Anglican welfare, which is now Anglican community services. And the other side of it became the secular counselling for all schools. And Singapore hasn't got that many secular voluntary NGOs. We've been lucky that the religions in Singapore, all kinds of, going right back to the Buddhist anti-opium societies, we've had all the religions providing services, but we don't have that many secular services. And out of Anglican welfare and out of Anglican schools counselling, then grew a much bigger organisation that's still flourishing today. Thank you, Margaret.
I'd like to speak about Francis Thomas as a person who personally empowers me. I relate, those of you who have read my memoirs or rules, to incidents in which he made me feel that I was, what is the word, somebody. I mean, I was a young teacher. I taught in St Andrews School from about 62 to about 66. And one day I went up to him because I had been very impatient teaching literature and romantic literature to my pre-U 1 and 2 students. And if you know a little bit of English history, romantic literature stopped with Keats. And I went up to Mr. Thomas and I said, Mr. Thomas, are we going to pretend that English literature stopped with Keats? Because no school, I think there was one other school, reference institution, offered to teach the modern paper. The modern paper would be writers of the 20th century. So I complained to him, I said, Mr. Thomas, we cannot really start in the romantic period. I would like to do something about the literature curriculum in PU1 and PU2. He said, what would you like to do? I said, I would like to teach the modern writers. And he pulled out from his drawer a modern curriculum, and he looked at the list of people. He says, T.S. Eliot, selected poems, W.B. Yeats, selected poems, Robert Graves, Goodbye to All That, James Joyce, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Are you sure you want to teach these people? I said, yes, Mr. Thomas, I'll try. I was a young, fresh graduate, and I thought I could conquer the world, at least as far as teaching T.S. Eliot and James Joyce was concerned. And Thomas says, I'll think about it. And the next day he said, go ahead. And that was how the modern paper was introduced to secondary school. I'm very proud of it. I had a lot of problems teaching TSL. But if you ask some of my students, some of whom may be here, they'll remember that I was a good teacher, reasonably good teacher of Joyce's novel, The Portrait of an Artist, as a young man. And so I must thank Francis Thomas for giving me the chance to do something a little bit, for those times, a little bit extraordinary. Because the only other school that dared to teach it was Raffles Institution. I think they taught it for 2 straight years and they dropped it. Why? Because the results were bad. A familiar refrain in Singapore. And the other thing that in which he empowered me was one day I read an article in a magazine called NYLTI. I don't quite remember what magazine it was. It was some magazine. And then I saw an article by Francis Thomas, and guess what? Francis Thomas had quoted Robert Yew. I felt, well, I mean, my principal quoting my poems, you know how wonderful it felt to be quoted, and how wonderful to be quoted by your principal. Francis Thomas was that kind of person who empowers people. And I'm going to talk, and I could go on talking about him for a long time, but I'm going to end by quoting a letter he wrote to me. I've got here in front of me 6 letters he wrote to me, and I do hope in time, Margaret, we might be able to do a biography of it. Someone else might have helped to include these letters. And I'm going to read them to you, because I think they are, you can see it's dated. He wrote this to me 1967 when I was a student in London. And I'm going to read it. School news. TV Singapura have persuaded Raffles St Andrews to play a special match on Sunday next in the Padang, to be televised live as part of a series of rugged society telecasts of rugged. There is no letter from one city to another is complete without reference to rugged. The other 2 matches are an Australian EMU team on Saturday and combined services on Monday. We beat Raffles for the 1967 Rugger Championships at Jalan Besar, but they won a new cup, the Kiwi Cup, for scoring more points than we did on our 2 friendlies. And he goes on to say, this morning I came 6 strokes each to Baliwan Singh, Sen King, and Chua Keng Soon for beating up Chan Wan Sing and Man Kian in Moonstone Lane yesterday. This afraid caused someone to phone up for the police, who sent a patrol car and brought the 2 beat-up victims to my house for the school to take action. And then he ends with a piece about Margaret, and Margaret's permission. My daughter Margaret is getting a brilliant result and will be lucky if she has a clear entry to preview class. Of the results announced so far, she has A2, B6, and B7. I hope we can sneak her into our preview arts cluster. She hates the idea of being under me as principal, which I take as a compliment. I could go on.
It's a slightly different account of how I got to tsunami.
I could go on about Francis Thomas, but I must end with something which I think is historically correct. I think it might be in this house at the time when the Lee Kuan Yew government was in trouble for a scandal related to his education minister, that, remember, Francis Thomas crossed over, and I think Lee Kuan Yew lost his majority. And I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew referred to that event and said of Francis Thomas, the only honest man in the Labour Party, or Labour Front, the only honest man in the Labour Front party. I leave you with that comment by Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here today. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes. To be here today, to join in this wonderful celebration of the launch of Francis Thomas' book, and to meet up with old friends and colleagues from way back when. When Margaret first invited me to take part in this event, I was thrilled because this would give me the opportunity to pay public tribute to someone I've always held in the highest respect and regard. And now I'm going to tell you about an incident, which, though small though it was, has been filed in my memory as one of the most, as I would say, one of the most significant and cherished experiences of my life. Now, more than 40 years ago, I was a young teacher in St. Andrews Secondary School when Mr. Thomas was principal. I had newly arrived from Malaysia, had just given birth to my second baby. My first one was 1.5 years old. I was desperate for a job to help my poor struggling husband, and therefore was in the worst possible position to balance the needs, the demands of family and work. And to top it all, the two housemates I employed to take care of my babies and do the housework were hopelessly inept, always quarreling with each other and neglecting my children. Now, a typical day for me at St. Andrews would be something like this. During recess and sometimes in between lessons, I would rush to the common phone in the staff room to make a frantic call home to check to see whether my babies had been fed, had been washed, had been given their medicine. And each call would end with me shrieking exasperated instructions into the phone. Oh, I was such a mess. And one day I knew that I'd come to the end of my tether. I went to Mr. Thomas' office and said tearfully I was resigning because I couldn't cope anymore. Now, I'll never forget the kind look he gave me and the words he said, calmly and reassuringly. He said, "Don't leave, we need you. Go and take as much leave as you need and then come back." Now, as it turned out, I took only 2 days, and it would be a while before I understood the full implications of that seeming benign act of a principal in the context of the regulations and the rules that govern schools in those days in a very rigid educational system. Now, if Mr. Thomas had abided by regulations, I probably would have to apply formally for leave and then wait for the processing of the application. I would have to come back at the appointed leave and so on. As it turned out, he just dismissed all these requirements. It was an act of courageous initiative. Courageous, because goodness, if you were a principal, you couldn't give that kind of carte blanche to an officer who could very well abuse it. Now, but it was his spontaneous, his trusting generosity that made him dismiss all the administrative what-ifs and buts. All he saw was a staff member in distress, and all he wanted to do was to relieve that distress. Other things could come later. A small enough incident, but since then, you know, it has come to embody for me what I consider the 3 most important attributes of the human condition: compassion, courage, and trust. Now, years later, when my first book of short stories came out, an interviewer commented that although my stories were often touched with a hard-edged sense of irony and even cynicism, they were always underlaid by passionate humanity. And I was almost tempted to tell the interviewer about that instant, that inspiring instant in my life so many years ago. And now I must tell you something different about a regret. Yes, a regret, because I really regretted that I had not made use of an opportunity to reciprocate that act. Not with compassion and kindness, because Mr. Thomas, in his position as principal, didn't need that, but with something like thoughtfulness and cheer, which I think he would have appreciated. Now let me explain. As an English language teacher, I often had the pleasure of coming across howlers, student mistakes in my students' compositions, mistakes as a result of misspellings, wrong use of words, distortions, contortions of English syntax, and so on. I'm sure you are familiar with these mistakes, right? And if I had shared them with Mr. Thomas, who had a certain sense of humor, I think he would have been entertained. And now I'm going to entertain you by giving you examples of these student howlers. Not from my collection, but even better, from a compilation, a certain book published internationally. These are submissions by small children in their history test. The inhabitants of ancient Egypt were called mummies. They lived in the Sahara Desert and traveled by Camelot. In the Olympic Games, Greeks ran races, jumped, hurled the biscuits, and threw the Java. During the Renaissance, America began. Christopher Columbus was a great navigator who discovered America while cursing about the Atlantic. When Lincoln was president, he would only wear a tall silk hat. Queen Victoria was the longest queen and sat on a throne for 63 years. And the real gems for me came from the older students. Now here are two examples. I just love them, and I've taken them down because they are gorgeous. Based on misspellings. The first one based on the misspelling, the second one later. Now, the first one, written probably by a student of agriculture. And the sentence goes like this. The soil here is very fertile, as it is full of microorganisms. Wonderful misspelling. And another one, this one, based on an equally delightful malapropism. Sir Francis Drake circumcised the world. Now my examples are not really as spectacular, but I'll give you two examples that I've taken from the general paper essays of my students. I taught the general paper, and as you know, it was a compulsory paper. And being a very exam-conscious teacher, my God, I was exam-conscious. I would scrutinize past year exam papers to find out what were recurring areas that examiners would be interested in to test the students in. And I found one. Every year, without fail, the examiners would test the candidate's ability to write on various aspects of his own country. For example, what your government was doing to help the poor, the generation gap, how tradition was being affected by modernity, and so on. Now, I would encourage my students to concentrate on these topics and to choose them for the exams for two distinct advantages. I knew that if they write on familiar topics, they would write more confidently, and another bigger advantage, a psychological one. Their GP essays would contain information that was new and even novel to the examiner, who might never have been to Singapore or this part of the world. And just by being interested in your essay could make him well disposed towards giving the student a good grade. You see what a kiasu teacher I was. I'm now going to give you two examples of the GP essays, both based on misspellings. The first one. We can be proud of our nation, Singapore, because Singapore has become an affluent nation, spelled with an E. And then the second one, again, a misspelling. in order to raise the standards of living in Singapore, the PAP government must provide better, I think the student meant to write better public facilities. But left out the L in public, so that I found myself staring at this sentence. The PAP government must provide better public facilities. So there you are. You see those of you who did not keep the calling to the teachers, see what you missed. Now, as I said, I really regretted that I did not share these howlers, these student bloopers with Mr. Thomas, because I think that he would have liked them. But you know, in those days, I was a young, diffident teacher, held back by all kinds of silly reservations, such as what would the other teachers think of me? Would they see me as currying favor with the principal? So there I was, held back by all this. And now, in conclusion, I would have to say this of Mr. Thomas. You know, Maggie, your dad could never, ever have been a hugely successful politician wielding power and influence, basking in the perks and prestige of position, because his simple human goodness would have got in the way. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sukhyang, and as you heard Margie's introduction, I fall within the category of the last study group that must make this panel complete. And I say this because I was a student in St Andrews, right from primary 1 to pre-university 2, and I have 3 eminent teachers on my right. So I have to be extra careful. Mrs. Lim Jacqueline was my English teacher, and when she was speaking, I was actually shivering whether she would have quoted my mistakes. Fortunately, she didn't spot any of those. Perhaps I did them pretty well. Now, I just want to share with you all that to many of you, Mr. Francis Thomas was known to be a social worker, man with compassion and heart. And he was the one who started the St Andrews Social Work Group, which actually was community service based for students to take part in community service, to learn how to work with the community, to serve the community, even as a student. And I think it augured well for us, those of us who had the chance to be members of those groups and to partake in those activities. And on my part, I, in the upper levels, actually was a member of the social work group. And for the rascally group, academia was last thing on our mind. What we were hoping to do is always to have activities to justify our going back to school, not to study, but rather to take part in ECAs. And on my part, I was a case master, and the job of a case master was simply to be a kepo, go down to Potong Pasir, which was a village at the time, and try to interview families that were in need, that applied for help. And of course, we had every fortnightly on a Saturday morning to go back to school, and I had a key to the storeroom where the members of those families would come with the ration card, and I was very happy dishing out pounds, those days, not catties even, a weighing machine with poundage of rice, sugar, and even milk powder given out by the Catholic Welfare Society. And I enjoyed that tremendously because it meant that I didn't have to do schoolwork. And that was part and parcel of my learning also in St Andrews. But aside from the opportunity of learning community service, which today I'm still serving, I'd like to share with you all an anecdote of my own. And I think I had a personal encounter with this giant of a man, Francis Thomas. And I was only in secondary 1. You know, in St Andrews, when you are from the primary school, you know where the assistant building now stands. After primary 6, you actually line up and then you run across to find your own classroom in secondary 1. And I found myself in an average class because I was a slow runner. Anyhow, at the end of the academic year, we received our results. And of course, looking at my results, we were all promoted, we all passed. But when I found out from my cohorts that the results that they had brought them to a better class, I was actually quite disturbed, aggrieved, really. And I was very unhappy that, why was I put into the worst class when my results were equal to some of those who had gone to a better class. And this was towards the end of the year, maybe about 2 weeks or so before the school closed for the December holidays. But I plucked up my courage and without consultation with anybody, I just marched to the principal's office. And his was, the doors opened up with a swing door, like a cowboy saloon, those swing doors, and there I was, I knocked. I couldn't turn back. Nobody actually would like to face the principal. He was known to be quite strict disciplinarian. When I heard his voice, "Come in," I had no choice, so I marched in and I stood before him. And then I just looked at him and he looked up at me and he said, "Yes, what do you want?" Now I was inarticulate and I was in trepidation. And I just looked at him and said, "Sir, not fair." You know what, he looked at me and he must have wondered, I think this last year I got a problem. So he asked me, "What is it that is not fair?" And I told him, he said, "I just got my results and how come I go to this class?" And he asked me, "What class are you talking about? What year are you in?" So I gave him, I said, "I'm from Sec 1. Then after verifying or asking me a few more questions of my unhappiness, he told me, "You sit down," which is very unlike Andrews. You go before the principal, you stand, you don't get to sit. But because he had to leave the room, he asked me to sit right in front of cane chair. And he disappeared for a few minutes. He came back with 4 scrolls, like a spreadsheet. Then I realized that he actually had in his hands the results of the secondary 1 cohort, the A, B, and C class, and D class. And he spread it out and asked me, "What is your name?" And rightly I told him, "My name is Tan Soo Kiang." Then he asked me, "Which class are you from?" And I gave him. And then he said, "All right, what is your problem?" Of course, when you're in Sec 1, I didn't have Mrs. Stephenson with me as my English teacher. So I told him, I said, "Sir, you look at this name, I beat him. This one, I also beat him. I also beat this one. How come they go to that class and I go to this class?" So that was how I spoke, Blunt, but direct as a rascal. But Mr. Thomas had the patience to sit down and to try to digest what my true protest was all about. And he actually verified. And after a few examples, he looked at me and he said, "Well, why don't you go back and enjoy the December holidays? We're going to have a staff meeting in December and I'll let you know." So of course I gladly, picked myself up and then ran out of his office. Now, to me, it was something unusual because I didn't know what courage I had to just go. But to see the principal on my own was quite unthinkable those days. If you ask me to do it again, I probably wouldn't dare. But true to his word, I actually received a letter, a note from St Andrew's School in December. And it has got one line. It says, "You are now transferred to another class." Now, to my mind, it was something very different. Here was a man who was the principal for a school that had got more than 1,000 students. I was just an ordinary student, but because I had a genuine valid complaint, he listened to me, he verified what I had to say, and he took action after considering my complaint. And to me, I was elated. Truly, it changed me, it left an indelible mark in my mind that here's a man who listened, and whatever be my complaint, great or small, to me was great.
Although to many they didn't really care which class they went to, but I felt that it was not fair, it was unjust. And here was a man who listened and acted upon it. And I will tell you that it actually changed my life. Rascals don't normally care for exams and schoolwork. But because the man believed in me, I felt that I couldn't let him down. And on my own, I began to realize that there's more towards school life in St. Louis than just being a rascally student, just play and fight, you know. Frankly, the names that were mentioned earlier by Catherine were my cohort boys. So I'm very familiar with these boys whose names were mentioned. You may not have realized that I know them very well. And we were part of the same naughty group that wouldn't hesitate to use fists to settle disputes. But we learned. And I think what I gained really through all this is that in later years, professionally, I learned to listen. I learned to digest what others are saying before I act. And if it is right to do, I think I learned from that great man, the giant man. We must dare to act and believe in what is right. So I thought I would share this episode of my own, that and this is representative of many instances of St. Andrew's boys, some of whom are here, in their own experiences would have had this occasion to know and learn a lot of life truths, that we would apply in our later lives. So, ladies and gentlemen, even today, I am still very much involved in St. Andrew's in one way or another, and I love the job in being able to work with the school and principals so that we can impart that value that I have also learned, much of which was during the days of St. Andrew's and under Francis Thomas. Thank you.
My name is Yi Tek Beng, and I came from a little village in Johor called Yong Peng. In Chinese, it means everlasting peace. In real life, it was a black spot during the emergency. 1946, St. Andrew's was the first school that reopened after the war. So me and my two brothers enrolled in St. Andrew's. 1947, St. Andrew's House was reopened and the three of us enrolled in St. Andrew's House. I remember on Sunday, the day before the school started, we assembled in front of the boarding house. And in the evening, the housemaster came out, introduced himself. Here he was, a tall Englishman, and said, "I am Francis Thomas." And he also introduced the matron, Mrs. Morales. And so we learned who they were. Now, Mr. Thomas is a very private person as far as I'm concerned. He treasures his privacy. And that was all we saw of him. He had a car, a Ford car, open-booted. And in those days, we had to go down to cold storage and pick up our provision. And our happiest days were those boys who could tumpang, who could get a ride in the car and go all the way to cold storage and back. He doesn't eat with us. For 2 years, he never joined us in our meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I can understand that because he ate a different diet. And so, the butler, the matron, served him. Now, you would think, or you think, that a lady wins the heart of a man through his stomach. If you thought of that, then you are wrong. Because Francis Thomas saw the beauty of her in her heart, and he fell in love with her. And so the two became one in 1948. They were married. And they were married in St. Andrew's Cathedral. Can you imagine the joy of the boarding house boys? Hurrah! The housemaster married the matron. And we went up to Cathedral and we sat at the choir stalls right in front and sang our hearts out. I can't remember what the things were, but then we enjoyed ourselves and we were very glad that they were married, and they had the tea reception in the school hall. After they were married, they moved to a house called Bettles House, which is next to the boarding house. Now, Bettles, I'll just elaborate a little bit. Bettles was the colonial chaplain at that time. And St. Andrews did not get any grant in aid from the government. And so Bettles asked for grant. And at the time, the inspector of schools, they did not use a high sounding name like director and all the rest of it, said that, okay, we will give you grant on results of the students. Each student passed will be given 50 cents. And so that's how we became St. Andrew's School, Church of England Grant in Aid School. During their stay in Bettles House, one day the matron, Mrs. Thomas, saw someone at the fence plucking leaves, digging something. And so she went up to the person and said, what do you do? What were you doing? The farmer said, we are taking some leaves to heal our wounds. You know? And Mrs. Thomas invited the farmer in, washed the wound, dressed it, and then sent her home. Word got round that up the hill there's a lady who would dress and treat wounds. So many of them came. And then she could not cope up with it. Then Francis Thomas invited volunteers from the school and we formed St. Andrew's Clinic Club. And that's where we began our social work. The clinic was way inside the kampong, Potong Pasir, about 1 mile away. And I remember there's a temple and there's a wayang shed. And in the wayang shed, we attended the patients, our patients. Then it grew and we could not continue in the wayang shed. In fact, during that time we also got the help of St. Margaret's School. Some of the girls came to help us, I think more for our own excitement. Yeah, so we came. And the clinic was transferred to the school ground, and we had a room, and I remember G.G. Thompson officially opened And then the government opened a public clinic at the Upper Serangoon Junction at Maya Pichitia. And so they took over the duty of looking after the patients. So St. Andrew's Clinic closed shop. But then we did not stop. And that's where Sukyan said just now, St. Andrew's Welfare Group. And so from clinic to welfare group. Now in 1954, December 1954, it rained and rained and rained. And what made it worse was that the water was coming down Kalang River. And at Kalang Basin, it was high tide. And so there was the crash. And so the water overflowed the banks. And the water, the flood went up to the roof of the attic roof of the people there. And the water came right up to our boxing ring. And so there was water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And there were three things I remember of the flood. Of course, they are all heroes down there. You know, Mrs. Thomas called the help of the church workers, the teachers, Mrs. Chilaya, Mrs. Chong Mok Hai, Mrs. Brett, Mrs. Holloway. Some of you who were students of St. Margaret's School will remember Mrs. Holloway. And they came. Well, Mr. Thomas was in charge of the general in charge, and then we had someone who looked after the physical side, carrying the refugees. Now, there are three things which I remembered very clearly. The first is that during the time, the scouts of Orion Troop was supposed to go to camp. And it rained and rained and rained, so they cancelled the camp. But amongst the scouts was a young man, a young Indian boy called Shankar Kumar. He went down to Senate Estate and collected clothes and brought them to the refugee center. That was the first thing. The second thing I remember very well was on the second night, we held a Vesper, an evening service at the tunnel. And I remember very well the hymn they sang, which I later found out was the Seafarer's hymn. It goes something like this: O God, our help in ages past. Some of you know it. Our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. I tell you, we were so thrilled. We were at the second level, and the voice floated up to where the refugees were sleeping. And I hope they listened to it. The third thing which I remember very well is that in the school there were 4 toilets, large toilets, 2 on the ground floor, 2 on the second level. And because the refugees camped at the second level toilets were heavily used. But these people were villagers, they were not used to modern sanitation. And so the whole place was filthy, real filthy and smelly. And you know who took charge of it? FT, Francis Thomas. He set the example. He wore his Wellington boots and cleaned up the place. and that was really great. Then, in 1960-something, 65, I think 67, when we formed Malaysia, President Sukarno didn't like it. And so they had commandos try to disrupt the place. And 2 commandos came and set a time bomb at McDonald House, and they killed 2 persons. In St. Andrew's School, we had a tower, a 6-story tower called Lim Tek Kim Tower. That's another story, right? Lim Tek Kim's Tower. And at the top of the tower were the Allied forces. They used that as a communication center. So it is very likely that that place could be bombed as well. But before they thought of that, Francis Thomas had us held an evacuation drill. So all of us marched down the field, orderly, and all that. 2 days after that, there was a phone call saying that there was a bomb in St. Andrew's School. And so we quickly, orderly marched 200, 300 meters away. After 2 hours, all clear, there was no bomb. It was a hoax. And I suspect that it could be one of our naughtiest students.
They were fidgeting and standing up, sitting down, and I was wondering what was going on. And eventually I found out that these boys were the ones who went and knocked at the vice principal's door. That time was still the vice principal. That was Mr. Francis Thomas. And faithfully, he opened the door and smiled his wonderful, kindly smile at them. And from his pocket will come the money for recess. On his own. As it was, is caring heart. Not only for bottom passing people, but even for the little ones in school. Without fail, if they knock on that door, he will get the money for the recess. I remember vividly one boy who was particularly very cute. He was a Jew. And he's the one who unfailingly would want me to release him early so that he can go on to get his pocket money. And I always say to him, Roland, you want to get your money? You finish your work. So whether he writes it well or not, he will scribble away his English and finish it so that he can go and get his pocket money. And one day, just to give you something to laugh about, he invariably will go on to Woodsville House. There's a house of the principal where at that time, Muddy and Mr. Thomas was already the principal. And we shout across the fence for the cook with the name of Sobai. Sobai was a cook that could make spinach pie, I remember, for Uncle Prices. As my husband says, all things were very good with him, and he was very Asian in many ways, except some of his very noble thoughts. But he never loved the Asian food, Mummy? So, certain things like mee siam and laksa and all that, right? But other than that, comes his spinach pie. And so little Roland will shout across and say, Sobai, what's lunch for today? So that made me realize that not only Roland got his pocket money, he would even go to Woodsville House to have his lunch. And one day, when I was walking behind him, that was also my second
home, I would go and help Auntie Eng of Francis Thomas to label and sort of get all the old clothing that we collected from the church members, and that's how part of the money to build Church of Ascension came from. So I end my time there after school, labeling and getting those jumper sales ready. And the cook says to Roland as he shouted, "What's for lunch today?" And he said, "Tau yu ba." You Chinese will know what is tau yu ba. And that was, this pork cooked in soy sauce. And Roland shouted back to Sophia and said, "I don't friend you today." Because Jews don't take pork. That was the reply. So that was that all that joke going on every day. And Sophia has to reply to Roland. And I know very well that Auntie Eng is very well aware that Roland doesn't speak pork. And so he will get his eggs fried the way he wants, into an omelette or something like that. And Roland will have his lunch. Everyone without fail. Even the people in Potong Pasir will say, quite some time, when I walk down to the market there to do marketing or to do something, and then you have a reply and say, don't worry in Chinese. And says, you go and look. And you will say, Amolang tengah walk. Meaning, go and look for that European man with a Chinese wife. You're going to get help from that area. So my experience in that context is that they have loved everyone. No one who seeks help will be turned away empty-handed. And I also learned that the Christian faith is not about believing. It's got a lot to do with love and good deeds. Invariably, when we have to help, I was one of the young teachers helping in the floods at Potong Pasir. We would all be called up for action or for help. And believe you me, it's never short of 2 weeks. And as God provided help for the Potong Pasir people, it happens during the March holidays or the December holidays. And so we were free to give our help. We learn from the Thomases that you are not to only look after your own well-being, and that you are to answer the call when you ask for help. Don't look the other way. That's where the Christian faith comes into play. These are the memories I have of the Thomases, who had a lot of influence. Eventually, in our work in church, for my husband, myself, even members of my family, my sisters and all, when we learned from St. Andrew's death, and from my own grandpa who was a pastor, that a Christian faith means not only in believing, but in working out your work that you are so ordained to do, and never turn your eyes another way. Thank you.
Sorry, I missed out one point, a very important point. In honor of Francis Thomas, the road through St. Andrew's village is named after him, Francis Thomas Drive. And the road leads, winding road leads up to the Roberts Court. Bishop Roberts, Graham White, and Adams acquired Woodsville for modern St. Andrews. You might think Woodsville is full of trees, but actually it's barren. And it's named after the planter who owned that land. And Church of the Ascension, like my wife said just now, was Mrs. Thomas was the driving force behind the building of the church. And in the school, she mentioned, or we mentioned just now, Woodsville House, where the principal stayed. Now, due to the good foresight of Mrs. Belinda Charles, she's seated down here, Mrs. Charles, she insisted that during the building of the school, that building is to be preserved and is now a heritage center. That's it.
Thank you. Mrs. George, Mrs. George used to teach at St. Andrews. She was our neighbor in Beckles' house when we were at principal's house. And she went on to be principal at St. Margaret's. Also, she's famous because of her son, who is Cherry and George.
My name is Larry George. I joined St. Andrews in 1954 when Francis Thomas was a teacher there. I didn't know him very well then. I knew him as a compassionate and friendly teacher. Later, when I was my family moved to Baker's house, because I had very small two children. At the time the principal managed to get a house for us when Mr. Thomas went into politics. And they came back to Francis Thomas was principal. They lived near our house. That's how I know the family so well. What struck me most was Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, their adoration for each other. Not only love, the way Mr. Thomas looked at Mrs. Thomas. I still remember that look. It was sort of admiring and respectful look. From that I knew it was not only love, but they adored each other. Mrs. Thomas, as you all know, was extremely hospitable, a very good cook. She was a very nice neighbor for us, and everything tried to help us. When my little daughter was about to go to primary one, he immediately said, oh, she can come in our car with Margaret, she can go with her. Like that everything had been. Later when I came to know Mr. Thomas Baker as principal, no one had said enough. What I remember most is, not only he loved the teachers, but also trusted us so much. So much so, the usual passing up of record books, which as far as one senses, every Monday we had to pass record books, writing lesson plan. So Thomas never used to ask us to do that, only occasionally, very seldom. Another thing that struck me was his love and compassion for children. When I brought my little boy, baby from the hospital, Cherry, the first visitors to my home was Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. That time we were not staying there, we were staying on Woodsville Road. Another thing I remember is compassion for boys. Once I went to see the principal, I had to wait outside in the office because one boy was inside. Then when the boy came out, I went in. And Mr. Thomas had his head bent down. When he looked up, I knew that he was crying. There were tears in his eyes. I didn't ask why. He was my principal, so I didn't ask anything. And he said, the most painful thing for me during this principalship is hating boys. Now, those days only principals could cane. So he had to do that. So that was the most painful thing. Then later, when I was about to go to St. Andrews and St. Margaret's was principal, he called me and told me a lot of things about, in those days there was no training or anything for principals. They just pick somebody and send me to school. So he told me a lot of responsibilities of principal. And then finally said, there's only one bad thing. When you are frustrated or in great difficulty, there's no one to share with. I just close my door and sit down and that's all. I mean, if you're a teacher, you have many friends to share with. And then I used to visit him in hospital while he was that. One visit was very last. And then I asked him, do you remember helping me to speak the first assembly in St. Margaret's? When I was going to St. Margaret's, he asked me, do you know, what do you think you are going to speak at the first assembly? So I said, I haven't thought of it. Then later he wrote down on a piece of paper some points which I could speak at the first assembly in St. Margaret's. So I think that I told him, do you remember that you wrote for me points for my first speech? Oh yes, it was very well neat, but still he asked, yes, did you use it? I said, only that I used it. He smiled, he was so happy that he used that. After that, he didn't say anything. That was the very last visit. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers and others. We'll break in a little while. There's some refreshments around that side and folks on this side. But I thought before we call this to a close, I ask Teck Ping and Su Kiang and anybody else to lead us in the St. Andrews School song. There are song sheets around for those who don't remember the words. And for those who used to sing it when it was a boys' school, the chorus is now up saints and not up boys, because there are a number of old girls here.
I think Sukian is better cross the floor. Cross the floor. The reenact what Francis Thomas did many years ago. Cross the floor. Do you know where he was seated? Somewhere left. Anyway, we will sing the school song, all the 3 verses. Can I ask you to rise? Mrs. Charles was the principal of St. Andrews Junior College and St. Andrews School, and so she sings very well.
For those of you who are familiar with the tune, please join in. We will start and try and count of 3. It goes, first line, lives are in the making here. 1, 2, 3. Lights are in the making here. Hearts are in the making here. Mighty undertaking here. Up and on, up and on. We are arming for the fight, pressing on with all our might, looking for higher flight. Up and on, up sings through a flame, rising high and endeavor, fade again, keep the flame burning brightly ever. There before us lies the way, time for work and time for play. Fill the measure while we may up and on, up and on. Life time will not delay, time is running fast away. Life is now today, today, up and on. Up singing through the flame, rising high and ever, fade again, keep the flame burning brightly ever. Force in plenty we shall need, hearts courageous gone we feed. So we press with eager feet, up and on, up and on. Ever onward to the right, ever onward to the right, ever true to God and right, up and on. Up sings through the flame, rising high and ever, fade again, keep the flame burning brightly
Thank you everybody for coming by.